Been really fascinating to see some of the similarities and the differences between Gothenburg, Manchester and Liverpool. Like, there's quite a few similarities, I think, in the way the context of gentrification and people struggling, you know, in context of segregation, race discrimination as well. That was really coming through. There was we spoke to some really inspiring people who've been fighting back against some of those practices. And I think if there was one thing I was kind of surprised to see some of these similarities between Sweden and the UK, because I think there's often a lazy stereotype of Sweden as this place, you know, it's almost kind of like an ideal place for a lot of people, and it's a really fascinating country, but it's just interesting to see how people here dealing with many similar issues as well. But also, you know, the way that you find people doing like really exciting, really interesting things to make the cities and the neighbourhoods a better place. Yeah, it's just to capture points we can take away and any points for future times, either that we can all reflect on from the different things that we do, or things that we could do differently, or things that we can take forward. Like, I think it's quite interesting because I think in the UK the welfare state's been eroded that much that sometimes it's almost like a pressure, like people have been forced to take the initiative and do, you know, set up things like social enterprises or things that are free of grant funding. And while there's a lot of problems with that, and I don't think people should be trying to replace the welfare state, and it's just also quite interesting to see a place where people have been able to defend the rights and protect the rights in a way that in Britain you know, unfortunately we haven't been able to do. And so it's good to see how people can actually really achieve that and make something real.
Well, it's been very interesting to come to somewhere where there is still a strong kind of public sector involvement in housing provision, and also to learn about the benefits and some of the difficulties that are involved when you have quite sort of set ways of doing things that don't necessarily allow a lot of people a lot of control over their housing. I'm thinking of the Million Programme areas. We visited quite a few of those places. But then it was also really inspiring to hear about the way the tenants' union is changing and becoming more of an empowering force for tenants. And it was interesting to hear about some of the co-housing communities, which are more kind of directly comparable with what we have in the UK, and to see where the differences are there as dependent on the national context. It's just been really useful to have such knowledgeable people like around at you for 3 days. I've got loads of different perspectives and lots of information to kind of widen my understanding of the political economy really, which I can then relate to the context back home. The asylum seekers are placed in very bad quality housing and with very little thought for their needs, and life is made very difficult for people that are coming as refugees. So I think housing is one of the number one struggles that you face if you try to be a refugee in the UK. You know, people get ill just because of the terrible conditions they're living in. Mm-hmm. And apart from the fact that they can wait for years and years without any yes or no from the state. Kind of luxurious almost here, the Million Programme, the estates where people, you know, have a decent flat and lots of, there seem to be kind of services. People aren't just dumped and left to get on with their own lives, but they're sort of slotted into the social structure. Even though there is segregation, there are also, you know, we heard about how the housing companies are providing, you know, they have staff that are kind of looking out for tenants, helping to solve issues in the areas. You know, nothing like that exists in the UK.
It's been a real honour to be invited into so many different aspects of housing projects and housing solutions and housing problems. It's been really well organised and very generously offered from many different people that work that work and participate in that system, or that are activists within finding solutions to a housing crisis in Gothenburg. The welfare system in Sweden is still functioning in a much more it's much more functional than it is in Britain. So a lot of the work done here is still done through the municipality, and there is also still possibility for the municipality to do that. Meanwhile, in Britain, I would say, like in many of the local municipalities that we work with as civic actors, like my council is nearly bankrupt. So of course it's very different. It's a very different setup. So when we look at what we were looking at from our perspective, which is community-led housing or community-owned housing, that has a very different importance, I think, here or in Britain than it does here. So I guess where we are currently creating participation models where we co-own, or where we are also shareholders, and where we often take assets or buy assets, buy land. The model here is quite different. However, the problem is very similar of people being pushed out of their neighbourhoods, gentrification, prices going up to a point that people cannot afford to live anymore in places. The segregation that comes with that is probably very, very similar, because I think we're learning with and from each other, and that's how we develop models going forward.